The lamp burned low in the Renner kitchen, and Alma Rourke did not lift her eyes from the man dying on the table. Snow slammed the glass like it meant to get inside. Her hands moved without a tremor, packing a mustard poultice against a chest that rattled on every breath, and the lamplight fell across the scarred half of her face, while half the town watched from the doorway. No one was whispering now. 3 weeks earlier, these same people had crossed the frozen street to keep from looking at her. They had called her the pitiful thing Elias Renner sent away for, the bride who came off the stage with her cheek and jaw ruined by old burns. They pitied the rancher for it, and they pitied her in the cruel way that feels like charity and lands like a slap. Elias himself had flinched the first time he saw her, and she had watched him do it. That flinch told her everything she believed she already knew. A woman like her got tolerated. She did not get wanted. Elias Renner had buried one wife 2 winters gone, and he had promised himself he would never again stand at a grave with his hat in his hands and his heart torn loose. He married by letter, because a letter asked nothing of the heart. He wanted a housekeeper, a partner for the chores, a name on a paper. What arrived on the stage was a woman with steady gray eyes and a ruined face and a spine like a fence post, and the wanting he refused to feel had been creeping up on him ever since. But the fever had come down out of the hills with the first blizzard, and it took the strong men first, and it stranded the doctor 2 towns over, where no wagon could reach. Now the merchant lay gray on her table, the same merchant whose wife had led every whisper against her. Alma pressed her palm to his forehead and spoke low, telling him to hold on, telling him the tide always turns for those who wait it out. Behind her, Elias watched his wife work, and something in his chest had already begun to break open. What none of them understood yet, crowded into that kitchen with their fear, was that the scarred woman bent over the lamp knew exactly what to do. She had spent a whole life learning the work that saves people. Before this winter loosened its grip on the valley, every soul in the settlement would owe their lives to the face they could not bear to look at. Alma Rourke came off a hard road to that Dakota stage. She grew up outside a Missouri town, the daughter of a woman who caught babies and set bones, and knew which weeds broke a fever and which ones stopped a heart. By 12, she could stitch a wound closed with a steady hand. By 20, she believed a plain girl with clever hands might still make a good match, and a young man named Tom had let her believe it a while. Then, the Harlan house caught fire on a dry August night, with old Mrs. Harlan trapped in the back room. Alma went in. She came out with the old woman alive over her shoulder, and a beam's worth of fire down the side of her face. Mrs. Harlan lived another 9 years. Tom stopped coming around before the bandages were even off, and the town that called Alma a hero on Sunday could not quite meet her eyes by Christmas. She learned the shape of pity then, how it dresses up as kindness and leaves you lonelier than plain cruelty ever could. She decided she was a useful woman, and useful was all she would ever be. So when the notice came from a rancher in Dakota Territory wanting a wife who could work and did not mind hard country, Alma answered it plain. She wrote that she was strong and healthy and skilled in sickness and preserving, and that her face was badly scarred, and that he ought to know it before he spent a dime on her fare. She expected no answer. Elias Renner sent the fare, and a short letter that said the work was hard and the winters were long, and a scar meant nothing to a man who needed a partner. She read honesty in it. She did not let herself read hope. Elias had his own road behind him. He came to the valley young with a wife named Sarah, built the ranch board by board with her beside him, and lost her to a summer fever that burned through in 4 days while he stood useless at the foot of the bed. He held her hand and could do not one thing to keep her. He had ridden 2 days for a doctor who arrived too late to matter, and he never forgave the country or himself for that distance. That helplessness hollowed him out worse than the grief did. A man who could not save the thing he loved learned instead not to love. That was the lesson Elias took from the grave, and he built his life around it, like a man banking a fire down to nothing. He married by letter, because a letter kept the heart clear of it. He told himself he wanted hands for the work, and no more than that. What he did not know What neither of them knew as the stage rocked north through the brown October hills was how well the two of them were built to fit. She ran toward trouble. He had frozen in front of it once and hated himself for it ever since. She needed one person alive to prize what her hands could do. He needed one person steady enough to stand in a storm and not break. The valley was about to force the matter. The flinch happened on the platform, in front of everyone. Alma stepped down from the stage in her good gray dress, with her chin held level, and Elias Renner took off his hat, and for half a second, his face did the thing she had watched 100 faces do. His eyes caught on the scar and jumped away. He recovered fast, put out his hand, said her name like a question he already regretted asking. She shook his hand and pretended she had seen nothing, and both of them knew she had seen all of it. She had promised herself she would not hope, and it still cost her something to be right. The town of Coldwater Fork was watching too. Mabel Thorne stood on the mercantile porch with two other women, and her voice carried the way she meant it to carry. Word had gone around that poor Elias, widowed and lonely, had sent off for a bride and gotten a burned-up thing off the stage. And wasn't it a shame? And wasn't it just like a man to buy trouble sight unseen? The whispers followed Alma to the wagon. She climbed up beside her new husband and looked straight ahead at the road. The ranch sat 4 miles out, low and solid, against a sky going gray. Elias showed her the house without meeting her eyes, ashamed of the platform and unable to say so. He had spent 2 winters alone, and the place showed it. A chill of dust and neglect settled over good bones. Alma set down her one trunk and pulled off her gloves and looked around at all the work, and for the first time since Missouri, something in her went quiet and sure. Here at least was a thing she understood. By the 3rd day the house had changed. She scrubbed and aired and mended, rendered a mess of neglected tallow into good candles and soap, and put up the last of the garden that Elias had been letting rot on the vine. She found his cough syrup gone to vinegar and made a new batch that actually worked. She found the milk cow with a swollen hot udder and a fever coming on, and she wrapped it and drew the sickness out with hot cloths and a poultice, and saved a cow that Elias had privately written off. He came in from the barn that evening and found the animal standing calm and the fever gone, and he stopped in the doorway a long moment saying nothing. The way he looked at her then was new. He turned his hat in his hands and cleared his throat, and finally got it out, low, that he had never once seen anybody bring a cow back from that. Alma dried her hands on her apron and told him plainly that a fever was a fever, in a cow or in a man, and you fought it the same way, with heat and patience and not giving up too soon. Something crossed his face that she could not name. It was not pity. She had never seen him look at her without pity before, and the absence of it made her foolish heart do a small, dangerous thing. In town, Mabel Thorne was not done. She let it be known at the church social that the Renner woman had not shown her face, as a decent bride surely would, and someone said maybe she was ashamed, and Mabel said she certainly ought to be. The words made their way back, the way words do. Alma heard them, and folded them small, and put them away with all the others. She had a root cellar to fill before the cold came, and no whisper ever kept a family fed through January. October turned mean early that year. The old men on the mercantile porch read the signs and did not like them. The geese gone south 3 weeks ahead of time. The muskrats building their houses high and thick, a hardness in the morning air that had no business coming so soon. Elias read the same signs out on his land. He came in one night and told Alma the winter was going to be a bad one, worse than any since he came to the valley, and that the supply wagons from the railhead would stop the first week the passes filled with snow. Most of Coldwater Fork shrugged it off. Alma did not. She had lived through a hard winter or two, and she knew what a cut supply line meant in a town that bought its flour by the sack and its medicine by the bottle. She started asking Elias quiet questions over supper, about the town, about who kept what, about the doctor. There was no doctor, he told her. There had been one, old Pruitt, but he died in the spring, and no new man had come to take a country practice at the edge of nowhere. The nearest physician was in Fentonville, 30 miles off and a mountain between. In a hard winter, He might as well be sitting on the moon. Alma set down her fork and understood, cold and clear, that if sickness came to this valley, there would be no one but her. She began to prepare the way her mother had taught her, without asking anyone's leave. She put up more than the Renner house could eat in a year: dried apples and beans and long strings of squash, rendered fat, smoked what meat she could get her hands on. She built a stock of medicines from what the country gave her: willow bark and mustard and dried yarrow, honey for the throat, and colt's foot for the lungs. She filled shelves in the root cellar until Elias raised an eyebrow at the bounty, and she told him steady that a full cellar never yet hurt a living soul, and an empty one had killed plenty. Elias watched her work through those short, bright weeks, and felt the banked fire in his chest stir against his will. She was up before him and abed after him. She never complained, and never wasted emotion, and never once asked him for a soft word, and the not asking undid him worse than any asking could have. He caught himself inventing reasons to be near her. He mended the cellar door she had not asked him to mend. He started saving the best of the day's small news to tell her over supper. One evening he carried home a bolt of blue wool from town and set it down without a word about why. She held it and did not rightly know what to do with a gift, having had so few in her life. She looked at him across the lamp and said carefully that it was too fine for chores, and he answered, not quite meeting her eye, that a woman ought to have one thing in her life that was not for chores. The moment stretched out warm and awkward between them. Then the wind rose against the house like something testing the walls, and they both turned toward the black window, and the winter they had been promised took its first real breath outside. In town, the cold sharpened tongues instead of thoughts. Mabel Thorne told the sewing circle that the Renners were hoarding, that the scarred woman had bought out half the mercantile's dried goods, like she expected the end of the world. Folks laughed at that. Nobody laid in extra. Alma heard the talk on her one trip to town and said nothing back, only loaded her wagon and drove home under a low iron sky, and behind her, the first real snow began to fall on a settlement that had not listened. The blizzard that closed the passes came the second week of November and did not fully let go until spring. Snow buried the fence lines, and then the fences themselves. The supply wagons stopped, exactly as Elias had said they would, and the town's last shipment sat stranded at the railhead 40 miles south, under a drift no team on earth could break. For a while, Coldwater Fork made a joke of it, playing cards by the stove, rationing the coffee, waiting it out. Then the sickness came. It started with the Anderson family on the North Road, a fever that settled deep in the chest and turned to a drowning cough. It moved fast, and it took the grown folk hardest, laying the strong ones flat, while it passed lighter over the young and the very old. Inside a week, half a dozen households had it. The town had no doctor and no medicine coming, and a growing edge of panic. And into that panic ran a rumor that the Renner woman knew sickness. Someone remembered she had spoken of nursing. Someone else recalled Pruitt once saying, "The burned bride asked smarter questions than most men he had trained." When the Anderson boy, near grown, finally saddled a horse and beat his way through the drifts to the Renner ranch, it was Alma he came for. She was pulling on her coat before he finished the sentence. Elias caught her arm at the door, and for the first time, the fear in him was not for his own heart. He told her the road was a killer, that the fever could take her too, that she did not owe this town one single thing after the way it had treated her. Alma looked at him with the lamp behind her and said the words that would stay with him the rest of his days, that a person who could help and chose not to was a person she did not care to be, scar or no scar. She said sick folk did not care what her face looked like. Then she softened, just a little, and told him she would need him to drive because she could not do the roads alone. He was already hitching the team before she finished asking. They worked the Anderson house through that first night side by side, and a rhythm rose up between them that neither one had to explain. She gave the orders, and he followed them, hauling water, stoking fires, holding a thrashing man still while she got the medicine down his throat. She showed the frightened Anderson women how to bring a fever down, how to keep the lungs clear, how to spell each other so nobody nursing dropped from pure exhaustion. By dawn, the worst of the house had turned a corner, and the women looked at Alma's scarred, tired face like it was the most welcome sight in the whole territory. For the first time in her life, people were glad to see her coming. The word spread from house to house, faster than the fever now. The Renner woman is coming. The Renner woman knows what to do. Elias drove her from door to door through drifts that swallowed the horses to the chest, and everywhere they went, she brought the same steady hands and the same flat refusal to quit. And behind her she left fires banked right, and fevers breaking, and people who would live to see another season. Elias watched all of it from the corner of every sick room, hat in his hands, and the thing he had forbidden himself for 2 long years rose up in him and would not go back down. December closed its fist on the valley. The fever did not burn out the way sickness usually does. It kept finding new houses, and the cold gave the weak no room to recover. Alma stopped going home. She set up in the empty schoolhouse at the center of town, turned it into a sick ward with rows of borrowed cots, and ran the whole settlement's survival out of that one cold room. She organized the healthy women into shifts, rationed the medicine down to the drop, and sent the men out in pairs to check the far houses so no one died alone and unfound in the snow. She slept in snatches on a hard bench and woke at every cough that changed its sound. Elias never left her side. He had a ranch 4 miles off, with stock that needed him, and he arranged for a neighbor's boy to see to it. And he stayed. He became her hands and her back and her voice when her own gave out. He carried the failing in from the cold and carried the dead out with his hat off, and in between, he watched his wife hold an entire town up on the strength of 2 arms, and would not have been anywhere else on the earth. The shame he had carried since the platform had burned clean off him. What was left was something he had no more power to stop than a man can stop the sunrise. Then the sickness came for the Thorne house. Mabel Thorne herself came through the schoolhouse door with the snow still white on her shoulders, gray-faced and stripped of every ounce of her porch talk pride, because Harold Thorne the merchant had gone blue at the lips and could not draw a full breath. She stood in front of the very woman she had spent 2 months tearing down, and she could not get the words out, and she did not have to. Alma was already reaching for her coat and her bag. She followed Mabel out into the storm without one word about all the words that had been said. Harold Thorne was the worst case she had seen all winter. The fever had gone deep into both lungs, and by the time Alma reached him, he was fighting for every breath, his family already half sunk into their mourning. She worked on him for 2 days and 2 nights with hardly any real sleep. She steamed the room and drained his chest and forced the medicine down and turned him and pounded his back and breathed her own stubbornness into him when his own gave out. On the 3rd morning the fever broke, and Harold Thorne opened his eyes and asked, hoarse and wondering, for his wife. The man whose wife had led the whispering now owed that same scarred woman every breath he would ever draw again. Mabel Thorne stood in the doorway and shook, and something in her broke all the way open. She tried to speak and choked on it, and finally got out that she had been wicked, that she had said cruel things about a woman who had just saved her whole life, and that she did not know how a person got forgiven for that. Alma looked at her a long, tired moment. Then she said only that they had a great deal of nursing still ahead of them, and not near enough hands, and that Mabel had 2 good ones, and that would settle the account fine. It was mercy without a drop of sugar in it, and Mabel took it and wept and rolled up her sleeves. Late that same night, Elias found Alma alone, behind the schoolhouse, standing out in the killing cold, with her face lifted to the dark, worn down past the edge of herself. He came and stood close, and asked her what was wrong, when she had just done the impossible thing. She told him the truth she had never told a living soul, quiet, that she had always known she could be useful, that useful had never once been the same as wanted, and that she was so tired of being the hands people ran for, and never the person anyone kept. The confession hung there in the frozen air. Elias took her scarred face in both his cold hands and turned it up to his, and did not flinch, not by a hair, and told her she was wrong about that, and that he meant to spend the rest of his life proving it to her. The fever broke its back in January. House by house the valley came up for air, weak and thinned but alive, and when the survivors counted their dead, they found the number small enough to be a miracle in a winter like that one. Everyone in Coldwater Fork knew the name of the miracle. They had watched her walk through their doors when the doctor was dead, and the wagons were stopped, and even God seemed to have forgotten the valley, and they knew to a soul that they were still breathing because Alma Renner had refused to quit on them. The town gathered in the little church the first Sunday the roads allowed it, to give thanks for coming through alive. It was meant to be a quiet service, but Harold Thorne stood up in his pew, still gray and thin as a rail, and would not sit until he had said his piece. He told the whole congregation, in a voice that cracked and would not steady, that he was alive because of the woman some of them had called ugly and worse, and that he had heard those words spoken and been too proud to stop them, and that he was ashamed before God and everybody in the room. He looked straight at his own wife when he said it. Mabel sat with her head bowed and did not hide her face. Then someone at the back, an old sourness that had not learned one thing all winter, muttered that scarred was still scarred, and meant it to sting. Elias Renner was on his feet before the words had finished landing. He was not a man who made speeches, and the whole church turned to see the quiet rancher standing white-knuckled with his hat crushed in one hand. He said that he had been the worst of them once, that he had flinched at his own wife on the day she came, on a train platform in front of the whole town, and had been ashamed of it every day since, because it was the smallest thing he had ever done. He said he had spent a winter watching that face by lamplight while it saved one life after another, and that he had learned to read it the way a man reads country he means to live on for good. He said the scar was no ruin at all. It was the mark of the day she ran into a burning house for a woman who was not even her kin, and there was not a person in that church who carried her kind of courage in the worst inch of their skin. He turned and found her in the crowd and spoke the rest of it straight to her, in front of all of them, his voice gone rough. He told Alma Renner that she was the finest thing that had ever come to the valley, that he had married her to keep his own heart safe, and she had gone and saved it instead, and that he loved her past all his sense and all his fear, and did not care one bit who heard him say it. The church had gone dead silent. Alma stood with her hand at her throat, and 2 months of held-back tears finally getting loose, and she could not make her voice work at all, so she crossed the room to him instead, past every staring face, and laid her scarred cheek against his chest, where all of them could see her choose it. His arms came around her, like he would never again make the mistake of holding anything loosely. The whole town saw the burned bride wanted at last, out loud, by the very man who had once looked away. Mabel Thorne was the first to stand, and it was she who started the thing that swept the church, the whole grateful settlement rising to its feet for the woman it had pitied, and now could not imagine living without. Alma lifted her wet face from her husband's chest and looked out at all of them, and for the first time in her life, she did not fold the moment small to tuck it away. She let herself keep it. Outside, the sun lay bright on the snow, and the passes would open soon, and the valley they had all saved together stretched living and clean, under a sky finally gone kind. Spring came late, and hard-won to Coldwater Fork, and the valley that dug itself out of that winter was not the same one the snow had buried. The people who had once crossed the street from Alma Renner now stopped her on it to say her name with plain respect. Farmers who had laughed at a full cellar in October came to her that spring to ask how a body learned to lay in against the next bad year. The schoolhouse went back to being a schoolhouse, but they kept one cabinet of it stocked and ready under her direction, because the valley had learned it never again wanted to be caught without her. She was not the pitied bride anymore. She was the reason they had all lived to see the thaw. Mabel Thorne became, of all things, her steady friend, humbled by that winter into something far better than she had been, and Elias Renner spent the rest of his life keeping the promise he made behind the schoolhouse in the killing cold. He did not treat her as useful. He treated her as wanted, every single day, in the small, steady ways a woman who has only ever been tolerated learns to trust slowly, and then, all at once. He would catch her scarred cheek in his hand, at odd moments, at the wash line, by the fire, for no reason on God's earth, just to watch her believe it a little more. She had come north expecting to be endured. She was cherished instead, and the wonder of it never entirely wore off her. The map of her worst day had become the face her husband loved best in all the world. There is one thing I have kept from her long winter, and it belongs to Harriet Beecher Stowe. When you get into a tight place, and everything goes against you, till it seems you could not hold on a minute longer, never give up then, for that is just the place and time that the tide will turn. Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote that, and Alma Renner had lived it. She had held on when everything went against her, and the tide had turned, and it carried her all the way home. If Alma's story reached something in you tonight, there is one thing worth telling before you go. Have you ever been valued for what you could do long before anyone loved you for who you truly were? Alma waited a lifetime to be chosen out loud, and the choosing, when it came, was worth every cold mile she walked to reach it. Leave your answer below, because stories like this one live or die by the hearts that gather close around them. And if you are not ready to leave the frontier just yet, you do not have to. The next one is waiting for you right now.